communities. Oh yeah, that's the same thing. So we come to the last session of the day. Interaction between ELISA and adjacent communities, such as Eclipse, Linaro, SPDX, Yocto, and more. Feels a bit similar like the last title. That's good because we went already in this discussion. And I will go through this, and I guess I'll give it a start, right, with a few.
Yeah, maybe we'll just plug.
And you can, yeah, at some point you should take over and say something because I'm speaking so much here.
Oh, well.
Yeah, sure, birthday.
Hide the chat.
Yeah, hold it down.
There we go.
Oh, we have this. We're in the ones. We're in the right one.
Yeah.
We have this, we have this, we have this. Oh yeah, this was the motivation, right? That we had all the challenges and should work together. I think that's where we want to end up. So we want to build a dependable system. We are not the super huge community. We are experts in the areas of safety and open source, which shrinks really into a niche of a niche. So we should spend efforts and collaborate and see where the different puzzle pieces fit together. And you've seen this also somewhere else. It's really like sharing the ideas and interact, which we did already in the past, where we have closely related projects which fall in safety critical space, maybe not having it directly visible on the fields. But it's just like some like points where ELISA has been active. And
I don't know what's going on here.
so as it's about communities, you can already see, I mentioned this earlier, we have open source centric community members already. These are the ones which are not the paying members, but we show also by joining each other that there is a connection between these, and we definitely have them with AGL, kernel CI, CIP, and also with the other people who brought Silta Linux MP project actually into Linux Foundation. So that's where I had this marked. And I took these items in there where we had major community interaction in the last year, more or less. So just to point in there, what needs in detail will come on a few further slides, so just to show like there is a set of projects which are of relevance and which we are already interacting with. And we also need to check how we engage further with others, because we had touch points with Linaro 2 years back or so. It was
Next week we'll be talking
the next week we'll have again. Yeah, that's what I wanted to mention. We went into check like drone code for aerospace, so we have collaborations setting up there. JDF can be interesting for standards, open chain also for standards, metrics, chaos, credit. This is credit we had last.
Provenance, yeah.
That's the provenance parts. Chaos, we already went into we're meeting them in Brussels at the ChaosCon this year, proposing our ideas, getting their input, like also what are scorecards kind of thing, where can you create best practices.
And they also have a set of risk metrics that is probably worth elaborating on further.
Yeah.
And some of this, and I'd be interested, quite frankly, to what extent the customable stuff can actually line up with some of the metrics we're looking at Chaos. So I think, you know, there's some potential synergies there.
Yeah.
For scoring.
Here, and these are some further Linux community engagement.
Yeah.
Not everybody has like the fancy trademark IKing thingy. So that's just some part where we have been from subsystem side. We had stress NG interactions always with Colin at the LMVM CAF part last year with the university interaction.
Yeah, and yeah, with the university interactions, and then GCOV is what has been used in kernel CI, because they're starting to get interested in coverage aspects, and so trying to get both of the systems working with it is something I think we want to see help.
And then we are also started with kernel documentation for us, which Johnson covered and others to talk about these things. So this is like, we are the enabling Linux in safety application project, and we're getting more and more interaction with Linux kernel community. And this was something which people were saying in the past, so you are in this Linux field, but how much do you interact with kernel being there? And this is really a great step, which we established also during last year and continue to grow.
And then the first Linux plumbers. We actually had safe usage of Linux as a mini comp last year, and I know that Philipp and I, hopefully before we leave here, we'll have our draft submitted for the mini comp for this year. since it will open on May 10th. So we're trying very hard to make sure we get it in there for Japan. So hint to the Japanese folk, if we can get the safe usage of Linux going in Japan, please show up to it. So that we actually can show there's a lot of interest in Japan, if we can get it incorporated in the plumbers. Okay, that would be much appreciated.
You want to take on this one? I think it's yours. We haven't written a
Okay.
single word on this. Maybe.
Yeah. Anyhow, so obviously Linaro Connect, we're gonna be having more of the engagement in. The ELISA project has been sponsoring the IEEE Space Mission Challenges for Open Source specifically. And so we've got engagement starting with those, and that's kind of how some of the work started before. Building up from some of the space grade Linux as well as the aerospace as relevance to some of the discussions that are happening there. The flight software, space flight software, one where we tend to have a lot of presence from some of the aerospace and the Linux group. I think there was this talk about space grade Linux there. There's some work going on to potentially do something over in Korea. I've been talking with Ramon about that and see if we can do something in the fall there. So we're catching that, and then obviously Philipp is helping us form a bridge with the Eclipse Foundation. And hopefully they'll end up putting their logo up on our site as well at some point in time. We're saying that, trying to get everything to work together in a more effective and seamless way. It's kind of what we want, and certainly you guys adopting SPDX, we have a language that's all in common is another thing that I would like to see personally. But yeah, my biases are known. But so that's kind of what it's, so that's what we know about. What are we missing? Are there anything, are there any other areas that people want to see us, that people know are happening out there that we should try to engage in? Kind of what we're looking for. Because we're trying to make sure, please, go ahead, Tim.
Well, I'm an interested party, but I'm
Okay.
sorry. Oh, no.
You go.
I didn't say that, please go ahead.
No, I wanted to say that there will be a lot of safety mechanisms in upcoming SOCs. Part of safety mechanisms. So there's no standard or nothing. And from the high level, maybe there should be a view on how this has to be, at least some requirements or some vision of the requirements, if not the requirements themselves. How should be some of that stuff to be implemented.
Yeah.
Renaissance is doing like a great job with that, but I mean, what's needed and what to use.
Yeah, like in the space grid Linux, what's happening is the radiation hardening on the memory subsystems
Yeah.
is something that they're really starting to look at. And there's certain microchip has some parts that are heading in that direction
Correct.
for NASA. So, but hardening for safety and requirements for safety, the same way as requirements for security is definitely a topic I think we should start discussing from the Linux, from a system perspective.
Yes,
That's
and
what
then safety view on security components, like secure components, if like, for example, an army has secure wall, how this whole thing will be interacting, I don't quite understand, and I don't think that anybody does. Like, there's secure wall,
Yeah,
like what, I mean, how to use it, how to use script engines, again, interface level, OS level, that drives me crazy. I don't understand what's this safety view on these like separate, when you have a separate chip, like
Yeah.
that's pretty clear. But when you have part of or modes of operating.
modes of operation.
That's.
Yeah, modes of operation and documentation on how to use the modes effectively for certain purposes is completely
you
lacking
don't
because no one
break
wants
your
to write
safety.
documentation. And
you
then
don't break
Even if
scheduling.
you even have the documentation, no one wants to read the documentation. So how do you make the defaults make sense?
System thinking.
What a concept. So your points are valid, Artem. I don't have a solution right now, but figuring out how we can get more effective defaults.
I don't know, I
Effective,
mean, it's,
yeah.
that's.
Like
something-
we ran into this in Zephyr, okay? Where basically an analyst was basically running Zephyr across a whole bunch of other RTOSes for real-time behavior. He didn't understand the options that were there. And then there was still work that had to be done in Zephyr after that. But, figuring out what the reasonable defaults are is an art form. And maybe that's something that the Linux features group can start looking at and then start socializing. Because that's part of one of the things we sort of look at, that's one of the things that needs to be looked at. Are there other communities though, beyond, beyond this end community you're seeing, or do we have most of them up there that we think we should talk to right now?
No. I think from the hardware perspective to some extent,
Oh, the open hardware stuff.
yeah, with the open hardware stuff, which could be interesting from one, but also the RISC-V people, because we have nothing
Yeah.
as RISC-V, but RISC-V
Yeah.
even has an automotive SIG, and I know that RISC-V
Yeah.
preparing like safety.
Yeah, where's Thomas?
It's sitting over there, but it's just not there. No, so stuff is still there, but it's not there.
Figures he's not
He
there
will be
right
there
now, but
later
yeah.
and move with it tomorrow, but I think that's just, otherwise he would have said, oh, we are.
A lot of my colleagues are involved in the risk stuff, so.
A lot of your colleagues are too, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, figuring out where we have the gaps for risk five, for the safety story is the part, as well as we've got a good story, like where we need gaps for
There.
the architecture side,
Have on the agenda is like the Rust things,
right?
Rust communities
Rust,
also, yeah. Yes, um,
But I was gonna say, what about safety community? I mean.
What are the safety communities?
Well, that's it, I don't know. I mean, I
Are
could
they in
suggest-
the-
Upcoming best practices community.
No, I really meant existing.
We
I
don't
know,
want it.
clearly we can't get on ISO committees, because,
it's good.
but I wonder if there are any forums within
Well,
which we
Hey,
can.
Exceed
and
those.
you bring in a good point because, I'm not aware if there's something directly like a safety community, but there are safety centric events where a good amount of people, 60% plus, I would say, attending regularly, and this kind of makes them instead of
De facto.
community. I mean, if you go to an open source summit, then you're meeting old friends and you have also kind of community. And there's like the EXIDA one in October, the
Yeah.
EXIDA symposium,
Yeah.
where you have a nice round of 100 participants. I'll, just for the outreach to the safety community, I will be at the DKE next week and speak about open source and safety there to complete just German safety community. I think that's a good point, because we're just focusing here now on the open source side, but we also need to have the safety.
So the one that I was thinking of is there's the safety critical systems club in the UK.
Okay, yeah.
which do a lot of, actually have a annual symposium event, which is pretty big.
Mhm.
And they also do kind of little seminars.
Oh.
So getting,
Yeah, getting in
talking to one of
touch,
those
please.
would absolutely.
Please be us in touch, means cross lines. There's a question in the back there.
No, I was just gonna
Other places missing?
point out, you probably know this, but something that could combine both safety and Rust is there's a new safety critical consortium by the Rust Foundation.
Okay,
That was founded last fall,
okay, thank
and
you.
it actually has members from NISRA, from
Mhm.
SAE, from many of the OEMs, many of the tool vendors, and
Okay, yeah,
probably be a great addition. to have
safety
it.
critical topic, Russell, okay, that's a good one. Go for it.
You mentioned hardware,
Yeah.
between operating system and hardware, you have firmware.
Yep.
And firmware handle watchdog and you are notified when something goes wrong. And also NIST have released a letter, avoid this algorithm due to quantum computing. So I think a lot of things will happen in that area. And firmware often goes into ROM, and we have to live with the device in a decade. So
Yeah,
I don't know if you're
The-
watching.
well, Zephyr is considered firmware by some, so I better watch that space. Zephyr's used in a lot of the firmware places. And so it's one of them. The question is, what is creating the firmware? And to what extent is it customized hardware, or is it something that is compilable to a general language with a microarchitecture underneath it or not?
But also, is it subject to any sort of regulation or standard or whatever, any
Yeah,
oversight?
we'll make a note of firmware, but the question is we have to qualify it more to get to be actionable in my mind for firmware. Because there's a lot more things there.
Isn't firmware something that is usually qualified by the hardware vendor?
Yeah.
So, because from my experience, when you buy, qualified the hardware platform from, you name it.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, like,
It also comes with the, qualified firmware. So,
yeah,
In
so
some
like all the
cases,
Chromebooks right now have Zephyr as their firmware,
mm.
okay, for monitoring when it's in low power state. all the laptops shipping x86 right now are having firmware in Zephyr's firmware. So it's just a question of what you define firmware to be. And what you're actually looking for functionality.
In general, it feels that there will be a need to make some choices about for the target. Because, for example, the fuse side with the hypervisor means that you need to have hardware which can run a hypervisor, and also the secure environment mentioned earlier. You need to have support for a TE, which at least on Arm is optional.
Yeah.
So at that point, it seems that it's not so much of Linux
No,
anymore.
it's the environment around
Yeah.
Linux may run as part of, which is,
But that means that if you want to go further, then you really have to choose something, at least one pilot.
and I think when we get there, we'll see that. Jesus, let's come back to you.
Okay, so I was going to talk about, I think from a different point of view, which
Please.
is as researchers.
Uh-huh.
Because there is some people mainly interested in understanding open source software development. And some of us think that let's say the theory for how bags are introduced and how bags and what is the system that is working and what is safety and all of that was designed like 3 years ago for 3 different countries systems. So I would like to find ways of talking to you. I mean, not me personally.
I know, but the
this
research community
kind of
talking to us, yeah.
researchers in a way that we can advance, because I see that we have the practical part of the thing. I mean, you know what you need, you see how the standards are not adapted to what you need. You know that the system that you're working with are reliable and you can trust in them and all of that. The problem is how to find a theory where that fits.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't make sense that you need to bend the standards to show that Linux works at this point.
Yeah.
But that's basically what you're doing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's a
And,
really, really good point.
yeah,
And
and-
something
and,
we've been challenged by when talking to safety assessors. And saying,
Yeah, I mean,
yeah, but where's the paper that proves that this theory is correct?
Yeah, exactly.
We need to write that.
What's the evidence?
So, but you look at, it's not only the evidence, and I agree with the evidence, bro, I mean, it's about the theory itself.
Yes, exactly.
Because the theory itself says system is safe or not.
Yeah.
And you know that's not right.
Yeah.
So there are a lot of shades of gray, for instance, there, and nobody can say this system is safe anymore today. And, but there is no theory for that. Because if you look at the traditional system engineering courses or whatever.
Yeah.
They talk about faults and they talk about specification, and this is a system that works because it's agreeing to
Yeah.
specifications, and that's not right.
And there's been some really interesting kind of relatively recent stuff written on this. Philipp Ahmann's How Safe is Safe Enough, talking about the idea of
Yeah, Koopman's got
safety
their work.
performance indicators, and you can't just rely on systems to always work. You need to watch when they're failing, understand what failure means. That might not be covered by your specification at all. And yeah, I think you're right. But yeah, there's a gap in the expressing that is a theory that you can test.
Yeah, there was also a very interesting presentation at FOSDEM
Mhm.
before the other Paul's
Yes.
presentation.
Oh, yeah.
I really still have to rewatch it because my mind was a little bit
Yeah.
mushy, but that's stuff like, yeah, the
Mathematical
testing,
modeling, yeah.
that's was really interesting, and that's, I think, yeah,
I would like
having a
to,
scientific approach on that to really prove things and challenge
Yeah,
things.
basically shifting from what's there today to something that formally it's understandable is the gap right now that needs to be researched.
Yes.
The other gap that's out there that needs to be bridged is the language that safety people talk to is not a language that the open source people are concerned with. So getting basics information about safety basics, safety engineering basics out there in a way that's digestible is something we're trying to tackle as a side project without enough hours in the day. There you go.
I guess Kimberly want to say something.
Go ahead, Kimberly.
Just talking about opportunities, I was wondering about like how about medical devices.
Uh-huh.
Because I also recently just found out that we are the side with Sweden and Denmark is part of something called Medical Valley.
Oh, okay.
And when I was trying to look it up, if anybody or like any companies that are very active in open source,
Mhm.
there's almost none to be found. And I don't think
That's,
there's any
yeah, that's
one
what,
here from the medical.
so anecdotally, I know of several who are using it, but they will not be public about it because of the liability.
Mhm.
And that's the reason we started doing the analysis with Open APS initially as a medical group, but we've pretty much taken that as far as we want to take it. and there's volunteers. So the question is, we're looking for open opportunity, open use cases that we can, study and figure out the next set of issues. The issue, though, I think, is a lot of the people doing medical device manufacture have concerns over liability. They don't want to do things in the open, which is very frustrating. Because that means it's hard to figure out what the common denominators are. Now, the medical standard, we've got an analysis of that up there, and it's fairly lightweight compared to some of the others. So whatever we do for some of the others will probably make things better for medical as well down the road.
Yeah.
But bring us use cases is kind of where I'm saying here.
Anyone with further opportunity. Otherwise, I just proceed in these slides because they don't come.
This is something that is represent. That's one.
Okay. That's cool. So it means you give a presentation, not directly as the opportunity, but the presentation just approach all of the Asian community. Great.
We would welcome a webinar on this topic in ELISA, if you wish. Probably.
Yeah.
Okay, anyhow,
That-
move it forward.
I go forward.
Yeah.
I get there's a few. What's there? So related efforts, I think that's what we called it.
Yeah.
Just to show like what are areas of interaction and collaboration. It's alphabetically ordered so that there's not made any kind of, I hope it's still alphabetical, but this was the intention. So that's why AGL is first, and we say like, we have interaction with the Meta ELISA, which adds on top of the instrument cluster. With the systems work group architecture, we already thought this. Then there is also the space grade Linux group, which actually has overlaps with the AGL approaches on architecture and the Yocto builds, and they were also from space grade Linux side asking, can you share best practice lessons learned? This was in there, and we have the demo, the AGL ELISA demo showcase. For AGL related, we have Yocto, Xen, and Zephyr. Actually, there the alphabetical is. But then we can see if there's potential for Eclipse S-Core. Covisa is already kind of touched also in AGL because you're having the vehicle system specification part in there.
We're using the Kuxa data broker.
The Kuxa data broker, yeah, because that's why you also come in. So you have also Eclipse touch point, who's Kuxa, which I'm not only the SDB S-Core part, but I don't know if there's anything in Sophie, but Sophie could possibly be something if you approach for SDV and you have ARM part in there, and so you know. This could be of interest to interact further, and I think the initiatives listed here also have some relation still to the ELISA project. Their chaos, that's what I mentioned. We had a presentation during ChaosCon to talk about the best practices standard. We need to build up more metrics about risk, taking in some of the projects related to this. Dedicate one OpenSF scorecards. They also touched this point.
Another one.
Trustable, definitely.
One of the other ones I missed on that one is the best practices badge. That's
Yeah.
in there from OpenSSF as well.
Right, yeah.
And that's been there for quite a while, which is why people sort of not think about it, but actually that tends to have a lot of the good practices from security. And the question is, should we start looking at some of the best practices for safety as we come up with them? Should we start looking at getting them into one of these badging systems?
Yeah. Fergus, you want to take on this?
Just basically, it's basically doing the Linux kernels commitment traceability and provenance. And I think there's more work that could be done in this area if people are interested. The Linux kernel manliness and the kernel docs, obviously, is areas that are related to the kernel and what's happening with provenance. One of the things I spotted last week at MSR was the mining of the commit messages for intent, which is effectively requirements. And so I think there's some work that potentially can be looked at, targeting in from the research communities beyond the Craigit work. But we do have that available to us to build from as we need to.
Eclipse SDV, I guess. It's cross-linking to the other slides, just to have it like as one part. So you see the trustable fits very well to the best practices standard, which we are currently addressing in these, and then the S-core part will fit to the AGL SDV expert group, and this little square basically is an arrow pointing to
It
implementation.
didn't come down.
It didn't come down, it was like conversion fault. But also the S-core architecture work could be interesting, especially for the requirements, assumptions, use, interfaces like from and to the US. That's what we also discussed during the day already. And this needs to be aligned with AGL activities, right? So it's a great activity in this field. Kernel CI, I think this is a very promising collaboration start already, which we have, because we're talking with them about Basil. Then we have the continuous compliance part, we want to have the GitHub pipeline set up with traceability and like seeing, okay, components change, what is the impact on the SBOM? What test case do we need to re-execute, which requirements are affected? This is something that's can be very interesting. And then also like kernel CI was interested in the GCAF LMVN part. This is what they indicated last year during Plumbers also. So we need to extend the code coverage part. There is holes in this topic. And here, especially with kernel CIA, which we haven't mentioned before, the CIP project could be also very interesting because they are already now supporting and paying kernel CI for maintaining or executing test cases for their RT kernel config and for their LTS kernel config.
And they've been doing some pretty good work on this, on some of the security standards.
That's the civil infrastructure or what's the?
Yeah,
Okay.
the infrastructure platform project.
Mhm.
Yeah. Sophie, I kept a bit short. That's directly with the continuous compliance part to ASPOM. So that's an initiative from Sophie, bringing it into ELISA. With Troy joining today, who's actively working on this topic. So he's the virtual participants. And this is then directly, that's just one point. And I think Igor.
So is there anything done toward the tool chains? Like GCC and LVM, they are part of what you need to qualify,
Right.
say, release.
That's something that really comes up slowly, with tools.
Okay.
Basil is aware of safety, Strictop is aware of safety, Ferrocene is aware of safety, and then I think that's more or less
I
it
think
for the tool
the
chain.
thing is that a lot of that work has been done by commercial companies who are trying to monetize their work.
Yes.
And so making it available to a wider community isn't necessarily something that they seem to be, like, if the question is, there has to be an upstream people wanting to do it, as opposed to a commercial organization who's trying to make money. Otherwise, we don't get the pull in for the wider effect.
The other angle could be if
Okay.
those communities, like those who are making the tool chain, are interested in provided in a more accessible format, for example, text automation, regression suite, that sort of thing that would simplify or standardize more
But
application.
your point about tool chain testability.
I think
and
it's
certification.
also for the other opportunities.
Yeah. I think
That's
an
something which
opportunity.
we're missing in this
Yeah, we're
part.
missing it.
Yeah.
Shouldn't that be captured by the governance CI?
I don't know. I think we should talk to them. I think they're mostly just focused on exercising the kernel with different tool chains, but I don't think they're interested in certifying the tool chains and showing and basically having evidence about the usage of the tool chains and the requirements beyond the Ferrocene one. That's the only one I'm aware of that's been trying to work in that direction.
Potentially, it's a lower hanging fruit because the tool chain is not something that you ship, so it has a lower bar of what you need to qualify.
To qualify, and you qualify as the language standard to a large extent rather than, I think so, yeah. I think that's one definitely to add into our notes.
It's often just defined functionality plus test coverage. So it's often something there, but if you ask the tools, they have no idea what you're speaking about.
Yeah.
So.
Okay.
You can also have a list of code QL.
Sorry, I can't hear you. I can't hear you. Get into project more. Sorry. CodeQL. CodeQL. For your languages?
For taking, holding standards.
Oh. Coding standard compliance, yeah.
They supposedly
Volume.
certified it, but they have a certification.
Yeah.
Which is.
So, yeah, there's a variety of coding guideline standards, like aspects of MISRA, aspects of some of the aerospace ones, and so forth, that are out there. And the coding guidelines and aligning the coding guidelines up with what is acceptable in Linux kernel is something that's, I think people have attempted it in the past, but without the right angle, the quality, a lot of the kernel stuff is way too much false positives. Like, they're doing a lot of scans already, but the question is, what is our goal with the guidelines and changing the guidelines for the kernel to align with the standards? And there's no way they'll adopt MISRA, I'll tell you right now, as a whole. On the other hand, they may take some of the rules from MISRA and say that shouldn't be part, if a good reason is made. We went through a lot, the Zen community went through this exercise as well, as has Zephyr. And in terms of understanding what's there in MISRA, what the alignment is, and which things are in the guidelines, so that the code base can be coherent. The kernel community has a lot of different maintainers, lots of different entrenched positions. So it's a social engineering problem more than anything else at this point now. But it isn't to say we shouldn't tackle it sometime down the road, but I'd rather get the requirements, a template for requirements in first. Because that'll help us coordination, but let's make a note.
You want to take the SPDX one?
Sure. For the SPDX side, one of the things we're working on is making sure we have enough metadata to represent the full system. The SPDX 3.0 came out last year. It's going to ISO right now. And what we're doing is we're extending beyond what came out for 3.0. 3.0's got a basis for a lot of what we need for the safety phase. However, there are certain classes of artifacts, certain types of relationships and so forth that need to be defined. Artifacts, like basically requirements and evidence, so forth. So Nicole will be talking more about what's expanding into it, but we're also expanding into hardware so that we can describe the metadata of a system, because virtual twins, as I was telling you earlier about, okay, Tesla, 1.8 million, right? Twins of each car. We need to be able to say, okay, here's the metadata about a system stored in a graph, not in documents, in graphs, so that we can actually query all this information and actually understand where it's going to go. And we're going to need to do this for our software systems. And we're going to need to do this. And if we can do it, we can actually then have effectively a version of, a graph expressing what was in your system. And you also have a graph expressing your requirements. And you layer those two things together, and you should be able to actually have your continuous compliance case happening. That's part of the vision, okay? Is we need to get to the stage where we get continuous compliance. And we need these two elements. We need precision on what's included, and then precision on what's expected. If we have what's included, what's expected, then we can actually write things to check for policies, to check for practices, and automate this. And so that's part of what we're really driving for. Go for it.
How far do you want to go on the hardware parts?
At the hardware part,
Component level or module level?
like I say, I think there's a variety of, there's people in the hardware profile group that's working right now that want to take it all the way back on the hardware profile chain. And they're coming more from the physical background. I want to make, and there was some stuff already we started with there from the HBOM efforts out of the CISA. Realistically, what's missing completely is a whole virtual version of it. And the virtualization, the digital twin, and the relationship between what software is running on the digital twin, what hardware is running on the hardware, and what are the relationships between the digital twin and the hardware, where are the impedance things on timing. So it's more the characteristics in my mind. However, the idea with SPDX is to have a language. It's not to say just one form. It's actually having a language you can express what you need to express, and then capture it to the level you need to capture it, not being prescriptive there. If you just want to capture high level, I need it on this board, this Arduino board is running this version of Zephyr and this version of Linux. That may be all that some people may want to capture. On the other hand, some people may want to know which chip is instantiated on that board, because I know that these chips have problems with their misprediction of the branch subsystems or their prediction subsystems.
That's exactly it.
And
That's
that's-
why I'm asking, because
Yeah.
right now we can track to the board level, but in
Uh-huh.
our roadmap is to track to the component level.
Yes, I think tracking eventually to the component level is certainly an element I think some places will need. Most will only need tracking to the board level. The same way right now, most of the SBOMs that are out there are only tracking to the package level. They're not tracking to the source level. But for safety, we need to get this next level down, the sources, and which sources made it into your binary. which binaries, are running on your virtual hardware, which binaries are running on your physical hardware, do they map?
So the reason I'm asking is because since we're in the process of implementing this process, and while I'm not engaged in that, but it would be interesting to know which kind of standards are you ascribing to, so to know whether we should ascribe to similar standards, so just to facilitate this.
I would welcome hooking you into our discussions that we have every Friday afternoon here.
I'm very sure I can, but.
I know, but basically what we're trying to do is to find the right level. So we've got some draft proposals sitting into our commit repo for hardware. The other thing we're doing, and we've already got this in 3L, but we'll be extending it further, is one of the things that was being completely missed by the industry. They've got focusing on model cards or things like that. Realistically, we need to know data provenance that goes into training these models. And so that is actually there too. And that, as we talk about autonomous systems and so forth, is a factor that we're going to need to care about for safety down the road. So the idea is making it all transparent and having the linkage not as a kludge on top, but at the core level, and having effectively elements and relationships connecting things. So we can get that knowledge graph and putting in the pieces into that knowledge graph that we want to do the analysis. That's kind of where we're heading right now. And so I think I've captured those points by talking.
Well, we'll go just to the next one.
Yeah. Okay.
SAN project, definitely something, right? Which can we consider, we have the example system already, we have the AGL parse, some maybe something also for SOFI environment, right? So this is basically just what I brought in as high level. I don't see the direct relation to the Eclipse side, so currently because it's more on the upper levels for most parts, so we need to be at least, would be a workload on the OS, not directly with SAN.
Yeah, but we talked with the HSD.
For which fields?
So there, of course, the S4, the integration with we are pushing also for unikernels, right? And yeah, they're also interested in that.
Okay.
Good.
Yocto project is there. I mean, it's the SPOM generation, which comes in reproducible builds, reference infrastructure, it goes along with the AGL parse. I think it's just like straightforward thing. Therefore, we've covered basically the cross-reference and other parts with the example system things and so on. Let's see if this is something for the Eclipse community as well. I mean, you have ThreadX there, but maybe it could do to some part for Zephyr because of its capabilities and so on. It's not political potentially, but can be right if you have your own solution. A little bit, right? Anyway, let's jump over this, and this was the discussion question which I had. Like, we had now a lot of opportunities. You mentioned opportunities, you came into it, and it's like how to engage with these communities, who can establish connections, who is a contact point, what would be the best starting point from this perspective. So you see already how many directions we have, how we approach, where you say like, is there something concrete? It's like, okay, I know this people in there, so I would be willing to establish a connection on this, or this worked for me in the past. So this would be something like just from participant perspective. It's okay. I think we saw already, like we said, okay, I go to the Asian community and have presentation there about things. So this is like really concrete step into establish connections.
Yeah. And like Jesus was basically pointing out about the academics being interested in some of these problems and how we basically get that into their mind, like get the scope of this into the mind share.
Yeah.
What are you defining as a community here?
A group of people.
Birds of a feather.
Not just like, in my head, I was thinking like OSS community or.
No, I mean,
It could be
a community could, so there would be, like all projects are in their way a community, and like also there's also potentially a safety community. It could be the German safety community, or it could be, I don't know if I want to call the ISO a community or not. I'm not in this field, so I don't know if they are a community, but this kind of thing. So like, Rust may have local communities or other, but it's basically just like people who could be interested in the field are related to the safety topics. And
People who are wrestling with the same problems as that.
Yeah.
But just from a different angle.
Yeah.
different angles are we caring about? It's more views that come into a place, the more likely we are to find a useful solution for everyone. And where we go.
And we also, like we discussed, how to better engage with the Chinese community, because we see a certain language barrier in there,
In time zone.
and time zone barrier. The time zone can be a little bit solved with the US side, so someone, one part of the globe has to suffer definitely. But this is also something that's okay, is there someone strong in open source thoughts in Taiwan or Korea or China, like all these are all the Asian parts. We have good connections in Japan already, and we still suffer or struggle with the time zones, but we see there's a Japanese community there, and we are actively engaging with them. But this is not happening with other regions, so this is basically just.
One we didn't touch on that Nicole and I were thinking about is basically the open chain community for the safety process. If then we have a security process, probably pull something together for this, what the best practices are for a safety process for an organization is, I think it's something we should be.
Shane was.
Yeah, I think we
asking
should, was he pinging you
me-
again?
Yeah, when we met in Stuttgart, he was asking me, when will you start?
I think probably after we get through this next week, we can probably start.
Okay.
So I think getting it so that we can have a starting point and getting more people reviewing it from the process perspective is a missing piece we can probably tackle. That we can probably tackle in a structured way. Any other communities and angles on this problem we should be looking at? That come to people's mind.
Anyone had a good hook into the Ross people
Yeah.
in the Ross community?
Ross would be welcome.
This could be something interesting point.
As could quite frankly medical. But we need to be in, probably we need to figure out how to get into some of the medical conferences and talk about what we're going at with ELISA. And see if we can, get our talk accepted there and then talk with ELISA there. And see if we can get people that might have local interests and might have some degree of ability to be visible.
Something we've said many times before, but also having a way for people to engage with us, which does not involve turning to court. By which I mean writing things. I mean, we've definitely got better at that,
But, yeah,
so having the discussions on mailing lists again would be great.
yes, and people, I think I know this.
We have a directory now, we're pointing at some resources. Filling that up with things that we already have.
Okay,
Written word, I mean, again, for preaching to people in different time zones, if they can read things, if they can read that helps. If they can write to something and ask their questions there and expect a discussion, then that's important.
Kimberly.
Just want to add to the medical devices is not difficult fields to promote open sourcing. Well, it's what I've been thinking, at least, like I've recently had a lot of experience in the medical field from personal experiences. And I was quite amazed how much the doctors were communicating and sharing data with each other. It's like way before publication dates, they would already share all the data from all the experiments. So that means that all of the doctors were kind of really up their games, even before things like that. They don't really do that with like closed information. And a lot of the medical devices startups are usually being started by doctors. So I feel that they could understand the open source mindset.
if we get into the right hook.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so you just have to see like, okay, yeah, it's like this, for instance, like without the software. So how in the medical and community, at least they're so open with medical data.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't know, like that's just
Like I say, I think if you can point us to some conferences or something like that, where they're gathering, that would probably help start us off, trying to get that outreach going. I've got a few from the SBOM side and the FDA side. In the US, I know a few, like Medtronic and Abbott and a few others that I've got connections into, but figuring out where they're speaking, I think is probably the next step, and then trying to get some of this stuff visible, see if we can get some of them interested in the problem. Okay, Is there any more? To catch?
That's the last slide.
Is that the last slide?
Oh, no, I have one more.
Yes.
It's basically just like what we planned and just. Yeah, we have the, I think you mentioned it already, there's Linaro Connect is coming up next week where we will present. We have the micro conference of plumbers, which is starting, safety critical track. Mentioned today already, we're considering a booth at Open Source Summit EU to also just get into more interaction with the community there. It's also good set up embedded community there, so close to the devices area to the OS ring system part. We could also see if we engage further with Ask and Trustable and looking to maybe we can talk about a topic to submit for the community day. If there's anything from the ELISA perspective or so.
Submission open until 17th of May.
Exactly that, or
So we could.
just like what could be of interest.
So at least you want anybody's overview there?
I'm personally super open. There's going to be a planning council reviewing that, so.
Okay.
I'm putting proposals to the OSS EU events, which are getting denied here and there, but let's knock doors.
Yeah, and then this was the last one.
So next steps.
Next step, I guess, is something where we.
Yeah.
We had some in there.
I think we've had that,
some
some of that
actions, we
discussion
covered
already,
it.
yeah.
Therefore, I think we can put up the other.
Yep,
slide.
the other ones, okay.